What up fam? Welcome back to Be Creative, Think Creative, and today I want to talk about the camera I've been using for the past 2 years, the Canon 6D Mark II. I'm going to be sharing my thoughts about this camera now that I've owned it for 2 years, and if I would recommend it in 2020. Okay, so I'm going to provide some backstory to this. When I started photography, I was using a Canon T2i, and when I bought that camera, it was perfect for me at that time because I was a beginner, I had no idea what I was doing, and it was a relatively cheap camera. I think I bought it for like 350 bucks with the kit lens. It also come with a memory card, a camera bag. It had a lot of value for the price. As I transitioned into somewhat more of a professional photographer, I felt like it was time for me to move up. This was back in 2017, and that's when I was starting to watch Peter McKinnon and Matty Apoya, and at one point they recommended the Canon 6D Mark II.
There are no other cameras right now that are full frame, have autofocus like this, have a flip LCD screen. I think actually this is the only full frame camera with a flip LCD screen.
Maddie from Travel Fields, that you guys know, did a review on this camera, immediately called me after saying, Pete, I think you should look at the 6D Mark II because I think it's the perfect vlogging camera for you.
So when it was time for me to upgrade, I just decided, you know what, if Maddie and Pete really like this camera, I'll just go get it. I remember going to Best Buy, applying for a credit card, picked it up that day, and literally as soon as I got home, packed a lens on it and just went out and just started shooting with it. So it's been about 2 years since I got this camera, and how do I feel about it now? Well, spoiler alert, I love this camera. It's worked so well for me for the past 2 years, mostly in the photo world, but also a little bit in the video world as well. And the question that popped up in your head is probably, would I recommend this camera in 2020? Again, spoiler alert, no.
Oh, stop. Let me just get this right again. Either that or I'm just about to be punked.
There's a reason for that, and I'm gonna list it here in this video. First thing I really liked about this camera was the flip out screen. The Canon T2i, when I had it back in the day, did not have a flip out screen. It didn't bother me at that time, but once I upgraded to this camera and had the flip out screen, oh my God, it was a lifesaver. Especially if you use the live view where basically you can see your image on the LCD screen, and let's say you're shooting upwards or below, you can pull that screen out and flip it to where you can see your image better. It's also very useful when you're taking self-portraits. Some people like to get the Canon app and use it as a viewfinder. Sometimes I prefer not doing it that way just because I'm lazy. No shame whatsoever. And sometimes I just flip the screen out, make sure my shot is completely lined up, make sure composition is all good, and then I'll just use the self timer, give it like about 10 seconds, and then boom, you got your self-portrait done. Another thing I love about this camera, and mostly because Canon has been so good about this, is the autofocus. In my opinion, Canon. In my opinion, Canon, I did it again! In my opinion, Canon has done the best when it comes to autofocus, especially if you're using the touchscreen LCD screen. Like literally, if you have two objects in your shot and you want to switch the focus, simply just tap the screen on the subject you want to focus on, and then it'll just automatically focus on that object. And if you want to switch focus, again, just tap the screen, and now that object is in focus. Probably my favorite part about the autofocus is the face tracking feature, which is great for when I'm shooting videos like this, because the focus is always going to be on my face, especially if I just move over here, or if I move over here, or if I move back a little bit, or if I get a little bit closer to the lens. The camera is always going to be focused on my face, which just makes making videos like this just way, way easier. Since it's a full frame sensor, the image quality is just way better compared to like a crop set. You know what, let me just show you real quick. Another thing I love about this camera, it takes really, really good video. Like this shot you're seeing right now is being filmed on the Canon 6D Mark II. And not only on top of that, you can also get C-Log, which is basically where your image is gonna look a little bit like this, a little bit washed out. There's no contrast, no sharpening, but that gives you more to work with in post. So you can get a little bit more detail in the shadows, a little bit more detail in the highlights. You can shoot in 24 frames per second in full HD. You can shoot in 30 frames per second in full HD, which is 1080p. You can also shoot in 60 frames per second in full 1080p, which is great if you want to shoot something in slow-mo. And the last thing I love about this camera is the time-lapse feature. So basically with the time-lapse feature, instead of just shooting video for however long, it's actually taking individual photos, and it actually gives you the option to shoot a time-lapse in 4K, which is something I prefer. And all in all, the image looks really, really... You know what? Let me just show you this time-lapse I took in New York City. So now we're going to talk about the things I don't like about this camera, which are pretty minimal. One thing I don't like about the camera is the size. To be fair, it's not a big camera by any means. It's a little bit bigger than the M50, which is what Marc has, but once you add a battery pack, the battery pack makes it the size of a Canon 1DX, which is like this. I mean, it feels pretty good, it feels pretty sturdy, but when you're carrying it around in your backpack, especially if you're traveling a little bit, it kind of becomes a little bit annoying. Another thing I don't like about this camera is that it doesn't come with C-Log. Basically, if you want to get C-Log on the Canon 6D Mark II, you have to download the Canon Utility app, you have to plug it into your computer. It's just an extra step where I think Canon could have just simply just put it into the software. It's not a huge deal, but it would have been nice just to have it on the 6D Mark II. Another thing I don't like about this camera, and it's honestly the biggest gripe I have with it, is that it doesn't have 4K video. Now, let's keep in mind, this camera came out in 2017, and at that time, Sony's had 4K video. I think Nikon even had 4K video. But this camera that came out around the time those cameras that have 4K video were out, this one just has 1080p. Canon, why? I mean, it's probably not a huge deal if you're just doing photography, but if you're also a professional videographer, you want to give your clients 4K or even 8K quality content. Which brings to my last thing I don't like about this camera, is the price. This camera is not cheap. It was like almost $1,600, and that's just for the body. If you go on bnhphoto.com, you can get this camera for $1,200, which is not as bad compared to $1,600, but compared to the rest of Canon's catalog of different DSLR cameras, mirrorless cameras, and looking at the prices compared to the specs, it's kind of making me wonder why Canon is still selling this particular camera. Which brings me to my conclusion. Do I recommend this camera in the year 2020? And that's no, because there are just way better options compared to what this camera has to offer and compared to the price of this camera. If you're a beginner, do not drop $1,200 for this camera. Just don't. Just please don't. You can literally go on Amazon.com, type in Canon bundle, and you can find like a Canon T7 along with like a tripod, kit lens, memory card, maybe even a camera bag for about like $500. You're a professional, that's when I would recommend the Canon EOS R. You can shoot 4K video, it has way higher specs compared to the Canon 6D Mark II. You can also get a kit lens and of course a top of some other things for around $2,000. While I love this camera, I think in the next like couple months or so, I think it will be time for me to move on to something else. I've been really thinking about that Canon R5 because it can shoot like 8K video, more points in the autofocus. It's mirrorless, so it would be a lot smaller. Maybe that's something I would love to get. Unless Canon wants to send me a sample model for me to try out. Canon, call me. And that's about it from me, guys. What camera are you looking at right now? Are you looking at Canon cameras? Or are you more into Sony? Or are you more into Nikon? I would love to know your answers in the comments below. If you haven't already subscribed, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that bell. That way you can get notifications when our videos come out. And most important, take it easy and stay safe. See you guys.